It's time for perspective on the programme now. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is facing his biggest test yet as the UK heads to the polls on Thursday for local elections. Voters will be charged with picking their local councillors, while in Scotland and Wales, representatives of devolved parliaments will be elected. Polls are already predicting the ruling Labour Party will suffer its worst results in decades, with Reform UK and the Green Party expected to make gains. Well, let's break down Thursday's vote now with Colm Murphy, who is a senior lecturer in British politics at Queen Mary University. He joins us now from London. Colm, great to have you on the programme. Thanks so much for joining us. So these elections are very much being framed as a referendum on Keir Starmer. How serious could the political consequences be if Labour suffers the scale of losses that are currently being predicted now?
Well, very serious. It's certainly a moment of acute danger for Keir Starmer personally. His leadership has been under a huge amount of pressure recently, and any electoral catastrophe for a governing party is potentially a moment of danger for the leader. I think it's also a big moment for the Labour Party more generally. As you rightly say, if the current polls are correct, Labour projected to lose approaching 2,000 council seats, depending on which projections you use, which would be a catastrophic loss. And they also look projected to lose power in Wales for the first time in the entire history of the Welsh Parliament, the Senedd. So both for Keir Starmer personally and for the governing party, if the polls are right, this could be a very significant set of elections indeed.
Well, Colm, as you alluded to there, the knives have definitely been out for Starmer for a while now. Could this poor result, if it does happen on Thursday, could that really trigger serious moves to unseat him? Do you think there's a long line of replacements, it seems?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I would hesitate on whether it's going to happen the next day is a couple of reasons. Firstly, there's no science to this, but the pattern tends to be less the known problems and more the unexpected crises that fell prime ministers, certainly in the UK context. And it is true that it's sort of priced in Westminster circles among political elites that this set of elections is going to be very bad for Labour. And the other reason I would hesitate is the global context, the conflict in the Middle East, which you just referred to in your news bulletin, gives Starmer an argument to say this is not the right time to change leader. But saying that there are a list of potential candidates, if they can agree amongst themselves, or if the wider Labour Party can coalesce behind one or two, perhaps Andy Burnham, who is currently not in Parliament but could be, or Angela Rayner, the former Deputy Prime Minister, or potentially another candidate like Wes Streeting or Ed Miliband. If they can do that, then Keir Starmer might be in trouble. I suspect that Keir Starmer will be fatally wounded, but it's unlikely he'll simply resign the next day. I think that's unlikely.
Well, another reason why Starmer has been put in such a vulnerable position is because he's come under fire over his lack of judgment when it comes to Peter Mandelson, his appointment of Peter Mandelson as the UK's ambassador to the US. Of course, Mandelson is in hot water over his links to Jeffrey Epstein. How much has that damaged trust in the government?
Quite a lot. So you have to rewind a bit to understand why this is so significant politically. When this government was elected, it explicitly contrasted itself with a then scandal-ridden Conservative government, which had gone through a succession of prime ministers and had been rocked by things like Partygate during the pandemic. And Keir Starmer and senior leaders in the Labour Party projected an image of responsibility and said that they would be a government that set themselves high standards in public life. That makes scandals like the Mandelson appointment even worse because it undermines the very narrative that they tried to construct to differentiate themselves from their main competition. It's also raised questions about Keir Starmer's personal judgment and how much control he actually exerts as Prime Minister, which has lost him a lot of allies and friends within the governing party, which is why his situation as Prime Minister is very precarious. It also hasn't helped that other people have resigned, but not him, because it gives the impression that he will let other people fall on their own swords rather than take responsibility, which is never a particularly appealing trait in leaders and is never a trait that makes you a lot of friends in politics.
Well, Colm, another key party that everyone's watching here is Reform UK. It's seen a surge of support. Do you think that this reflects a broader rise in the far right in the UK, or is this just a protest against the political establishment, against Labour?
I think it's a few things. It's partly the rise of the far right across the global north, by which I mean Western Europe, North America, as well as the UK. I think there's a wider trend here where the populist radical right or the far right have identified certain issues and certain types of voters, particularly in, say, deindustrialized areas, which they can appeal to. So the UK is not unique here. We think about Rassemblement National in France, for example. It is also dissatisfaction with this government and with the Conservative government previously. So if you're a right-leaning voter on cultural matters like immigration, hitherto you might have thought about voting Conservative, but the memory of the most recent Conservative government, which by its end was very unpopular, is still raw. So people are looking to alternatives like Farage's Reform Party. And it's partly because of the UK's voting system. Reform are actually relatively unpopular if you look at the polling for Nigel Farage personally. And remember that while they're on like circa 30% in the polls, a lot of people hate them too. But because the UK has a first past the post voting system in its local elections, not in Scotland and Wales, as long as you have the plurality, you will make gains. So although both Reform and the left-wing Green Party have surged, we are expecting Reform to make far more council seat gains because they're just slightly ahead in that front.
Well, as you alluded to there, the first past the post system, it's definitely reasonable when it comes to a two-party system. But as we're seeing in the UK, more parties are emerging. It seems like the UK is getting a European makeover in some ways, because it kind of seems like the way we have it here in France with several parties. Is it time for the UK to say goodbye to the first past the post system with such a fragmented political landscape now?
It's a good question. Voting systems change very rarely. They tend to change after wars and revolutions or declarations of independence, because they're kind of almost existential in a way, the very rules by which you operate democracy. There are exceptions. New Zealand in the 1990s changed its voting system after referendums. I'm saying this because I think it takes a lot for a voting system to change, particularly for the main elections, which in the UK would be a general election to the House of Commons. And you need a kind of perfect storm of factors. It's a good question, though, because if we see the current voter behavior that we currently see at a general election, then that will be chaos. The Economist magazine talks about a random number generator. If you have 5, 6 viable parties, then first past the post will throw up all sorts of strange results. And if that undermines the very legitimacy of the outcome, then that could cause a chain reaction that leads to some kind of reform. But it takes a lot to change a voting system because you need MPs to vote for it themselves. And MPs don't like uncertainty. So if you say to an MP, OK, we're going to radically change the system by which you are voted, and we don't know how it's going to affect your re-election chances, that's a hard sell.
So electoral reform not coming anytime soon then in the UK, perhaps. We are seeing, though, a breakdown of the dominance of Labour and Conservative that the UK has sort of functioned by for so long. What does a more fragmented political landscape with so many more parties emerging now, what does that mean for governing the UK in the future?
I mean, it certainly makes it harder. In the Scottish and Welsh context, because they have proportional systems, it's more likely that there will be coalitions in government, and it will look more like Western Europe, as you rightly indicated earlier. But in the national context, by which I mean elections to Westminster and also in councils, it will mean more hung parliaments, more no overall control at the council level, and that will make it harder to govern. The other issue is because we see a fragmentation of support, you also see greater polarization between the left bloc parties and the right bloc parties over contentious issues like economic policy, but particularly over things like immigration. And that makes it harder to govern because if you push in one way, you will alienate another way. So if you're a party that is trying to situate itself in the so-called centre and trying to build a coalition across these divides, you get it in the neck from both sides.
So, Colm, would you say that it's the domestic policies that is triggering this apparent decline with Labour, or is it about foreign policy here?
Primarily, but not exclusively, domestic policy. There was a very significant foreign policy development that harmed Labour support among the left, which was its response to the Gaza catastrophe. And that's very clear. A lot of the Green Party support comes from people disillusioned by Labour, and part of that is over its relative slowness in responding to the Gaza issue. It did eventually recognize the Palestinian state, but it took a long time to get to that position, and it lost support in the meantime. It's also true that going forward, the Middle East crisis may harm the government support yet further because it will affect the cost of living. Foreign and domestic policy are linked in some ways, and if we still see a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, that will lead to an increase in the cost of living in the UK as like elsewhere, and that might harm the government support. But saying all that, the main reasons are issues like the government having to break its tax pledges in all but name, certainly in spirit, if not by letter, to try and maintain funding for public services, the scandals you just referred to, and divisive issues like immigration, where the government has simultaneously alienated the left by being too authoritarian without winning over voters who are much more attracted to parties like Reform.
Colm, thank you so much for joining us on the programme. Great to get your thoughts on this today, and that breakdown was super helpful. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.